My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined by Max Tipsy Aita. Max, how you doing?
I'm good. I actually am not drunk, but I'm the kind of person who needs to walk into a room and inform people of that. A lot of people think I'm drunk, but I'm not.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it's too, it's like, oh, no, I'm not drunk at all. Well, of course you have to take a shot before you do anything. That's like the way you warm up, right?
I mean, it takes the edge off of living.
That's right.
Wake up, get my medicine, then I'm good for the day.
It's a flask in your pocket. That's all it is. You just pop that out, unscrew the cap.
Well, you got to top it off every now and then. You got to re-up. You don't take ibuprofen once, right?
Right. And I think that's a great way to introduce the topic of the week, which would be psychological fatigue. So fatigue in and of itself is going to be a hard topic to discuss. I mean, we could kind of talk about it from a performance standpoint, just the way it alters the amount of work you can do, the quality of the work you can do. And that would be within like a set, like within reps. That'd be across sets, that'd be across exercises, across sessions, and then obviously you get across weeks and across months. So it's a big question to tackle, which I don't think is entirely necessary. One place I'd like to take the conversation, this is something I've been just hearing quite a bit, like consuming content about training, is the idea of psychological fatigue. And again, I don't think it's necessary to define too much. It's more so to discuss it in the context of training and silo in on this concept of, I guess, like the interest or willingness to want to train.
Yeah.
The interest and willingness to want to take the next workout, next set, next reps. It's almost inverting what I just introduced this with, right? It's taking it from the biggest unit, working down to the smallest, and saying this idea of psychological fatigue can change those aspects of willingness to train, motivation to train, how you can prepare yourself for a lift, how you execute lifts. So it's like that headspace that you're more or less aware of that will influence training outcomes.
Yeah.
I think introducing it broadly as that is probably good. Is there anything else you'd kind of mention before we start into kind of how this plays out in the training hall?
No, I think that's a good, I think psychological fatigue or really any fatigue is like, it's difficult to quantify what it is, but we know the effect of it, right? The sort of symptoms of this, and especially with like psychological fatigue, it's definitely like the manifestation of, psychological fatigue or maybe prolonged psychological fatigue, and like what that effect has, or how that manifests in its symptoms, throughout our training, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, in kind of thinking about it and the way you were able to kind of describe it is, I think we can think about it really like granularly. I mean, we're not going to be able to do this, but I think it's like a useful thought exercise of taking like a muscle fiber, right? You're taking the smallest unit, the smallest like effective contractile unit of a muscle. So you'd say like a muscle fiber, and maybe you would stimulate that. So like theoretically you'd stimulate that and you would see how it contracts. Okay. Then you would stimulate it again. That decrement, you could quantify that change in, we call it ability, by this like concept of fatigue, right? You like layer fatigue on top of that. So it's like the change in the contractile effectiveness of the single fiber. And then you would say, and then you could kind of bring that up a level and say, we put you in some sort of machine, some sort of like isometric device, isometric dynamometer, whatever you want to call it, and then you just exert effort, right? You create force, you repeat efforts, you see a decrement in performance, and then you would take that out. You would do smaller exercises, and then you could go into bigger exercises, and then you could even go into the way that like the force expression changes. So it might be, I don't know, maybe you even have, and this is like just me kind of thinking about it, is like you could have similar levels of force, but it would change the rate of its development. I don't know if
Yeah.
you necessarily, you would probably have to call it fatigue. You'd have to call it something because it's changing the ability of the muscle to work. Um, so just broadly, that's kind of what we're looking at, is like, how does this fatigue influence performance? We're looking at more so from this like experiential level, right? Like phenomenologically speaking, like what's your experience of training in a way that leads you to altering performance, whether willingly or unwillingly. I think that, from my standpoint, training can like increase momentum or start to decrease momentum. That like decrement in momentum is going to be psychological fatigue. So that you go into a workout and you're like, holy shit, I feel terrible, or I really don't want to do this. And it's like there's a noticeable change. I think it'd be important to think about, okay, what causes that? So what are like the things that affect your ability to psychologically like get up for something, or to perform and maintain a certain level of performance, and then like how we can change that over time, and then what that management would look like. And then you just think about it from like a 40,000 foot level, where there's this concept of, we have multiple training blocks, we have multiple outcomes. How would the approach to managing that thing change over time? So I think it would make sense to start with, how does an athlete's psychology play into training?
Yeah.
Because training is not this black and white thing. You don't just walk into the gym and act like some sort of like automaton. It's like insert sets, insert reps, express performance adaptations. It's just not that simple. Like I watched it today, and I was coaching someone, and she was working up in hang snatches. She looked really good, did her doubles, crushed them. Let's do some singles. Clark's a rep, right? Tries it again, misses it, or tries again, makes it, goes up, misses it, and then makes it. It's like, that's good. That's what we wanted. Works up in the next exercise, kind of a similar story, right? Hits all the prescribed work, and then goes for something extra, can't really execute. So I don't think that's fatigue. That's necessary. That's not accessing performance. I think psychological fatigue would be training in a way that like limits your ability to get there or to get up. So if we could kind of differentiate those things, like clarking is not psychological fatigue. It's like an inability to execute. So it'd almost be like, that would almost be quantified as like a misgrooving a rep. So it's like, you're not tired. I mean, necessarily, you're just like, your technique shifted. You missed the rep because you couldn't technically execute. Or if you think from like a hypertrophy standpoint, if that's the adaptation or the outcome, you have some sort of like mismanagement of technique, changes the stimulus of training, and that like just modifies the outcome. Um, so from like your perspective, from someone who's super well read, super in the trenches, um, what plays into creating this concept of psychological fatigue? And just thinking about it kind of freely, and
Yeah.
seeing what comes to mind.
The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring weightlifting closer to the fans, athletes, and coaches of the sport. They're able to do that by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. And myself, I've been working with Weightlifting House for over 6 years, and I've nothing but gratitude and respect for Seb and the entire team. If you use code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, you can get 10% off your purchase through Weightlifting House. Order today, support Weightlifting House, and support the podcast.
I would say the psychological fatigue is going to be like the most obvious like expression of it, and the most obvious instance that I think everyone would relate to is is like an initial loss of motivation, right? And that's more the symptom of it, right? Is that you've lost motivation to participate in the activities that you found enjoyable or rewarding previously, or at least you've lost the you sort of become disconnected from
Right.
what it is that you're trying to do. Maybe you don't like lifting, but you enjoy the goal you're chasing or whatever it is, right? You've kind of, we could even call it, and maybe go so far. I wouldn't go so far as to call it burnout yet,
Right.
but it's that initial like dulling of the excitement about participation, right? Um, and and yeah, like it's something to me, something like clarking, depending on the context of it. If you clark a weight that you're afraid of, that's one thing. You might be physically capable and mentally
Right.
capable,
Right.
but you're scared to go under the bar because it's heavy, right? It's a new number. You might clark something because, a good story here is I remember training with Martin Pashov, and he was a guy who had done in Bulgaria, he did 185, 215 as a 94. In the US, he had done like 170, 211. And I remember him coming into the gym some days and clarking like 80-kilo snatches, like 3 or 4 times, and then just
Holy
giving up
shit.
and walking out. Yeah. And so it's like that to me, I think is, and again, this isn't actually psychological fatigue, it's the symptom of it. It's like what you do when you are psychologically fatigued. But it's that sort of like, it's this, like you said, this inability to get there. It's inability to get aroused, um, you know, in a literal sense. You can't actually turn on the things you need
Right.
to do, and it's like an increase in inhibition,
Right.
right? There's this like increased sensitivity to, it's an increased sensitivity to, I guess, perturbation would be the best word to describe it.
Right.
Any kind of adversity or any kind of resistance that the external world puts up, you have an increased sensitivity to that and a decreased ability to tolerate it. So you go in the gym and you're supposed to do whatever, 5 sets of 3 at, you know, 80% or something. And normally that'd be something you just walk through and crush. But, you might go in and like, it's a struggle to stay focused on task. It's a struggle to execute. It's a struggle to sort of, do them with the highest quality technique. Um, and so it's like that effect of psychological fatigue to me initially seems like this, it's a dulling of that sort of edge you need to, kind of deal with external factors. Um, and yeah, I mean, largely like it definitely, from an anecdotal sort of perspective, it is something that happens and that accumulates over time. The more training is not stimulative in an emotional way, and the more training becomes monotonous, the more that the training process becomes something that's a challenge to deal with. So like you see this a lot with, like, I mean, kind of verging on the idea of like overtraining, but the idea of having a program that's extremely monotonous and offers very little in the sense of like novel stimulation, during the process, which in a lot of cases is fine. We know that like powerlifters do extremely monotonous kinds of training, weightlifters do monotonous training, but if the loading and everything is tailored well and adjusted well, there's a it's not a it's not the kind of sensation you'd have where you're feeling the like this sort of like excessive amount of exertion needed to complete it. Like you can train hard, but it's rewarding. Or you can train hard and be productive and feel successful as you're doing it, versus, being in a different situation where you're training extremely hard, it's extremely monotonous, and it's just very quickly becoming something that's really an emotional drag on you.
No, I think that was great. I'd actually love to dig into the anecdotal side of things, given that you have such an extensive training background
Yeah.
and you trained so uniquely for so long. I think that's like it's we wouldn't say it's necessarily n equals one because there were a lot of people you trained with who trained
Mm-hmm.
similarly or came from different backgrounds, people we've talked to, spoken to, interacted with, who've relayed their experiences. But I would say you have this like long standing case study of someone who did the most extreme training for so long. And what's really cool is we have to speculate a lot on these podcasts. I mean, we just have to. Even me describing like fatigue in the process by which we kind of think about fatigue at different levels. Like I've never seen someone stimulate a single fiber. I've
Right.
never seen someone. I mean, I've done isometric mid thigh pulls, but I've never seen someone in like an isometric dynamometer and exerting force and then repeating efforts and then seeing that decay over time. So we kind of have to talk a lot about like theory, if you want to call it that, just something we haven't directly experienced. Um, Whereas you come from a background where you squatted and trained just every exercise to max for so long that that I imagine that changes your relationship with the sport pretty deeply.
Mm.
Um, I thought your point initially was really well taken about clarking being something that could be new in the sense of like this is a weight I've never done. That's not fatigue related. It's
Right.
just like holy shit, this is 1 kilo more than I ever put over my head or lifted in this exercise. That's freaking scary.
Right.
Or you could have like, and I've been to this place where you get so tired, just you're just doing RMs with down sets in every exercise. You're just training hard, and you're like, I can't commit to this lift. When you finally do, it's a clean. You contact your elbow to your knee, you tweak your wrist, and then you have to take some time off. It's like a forced deload
Mm.
from that sense. So I could see how you approach clarking from different standpoints, and you can almost measure like, okay, someone's clarking and they are normally pretty gritty. They normally get after it. They like to train hard. That's a sign that training's not going well, and hopefully you pick up on that early on because I think, as you mentioned, this process of that manifesting itself is the change in enjoyment and motivation, but it's also like the global change in enjoyment and motivation in that you can train and not feel like it's that fun. You're not making that much progress, but at the end of it, we all have this feeling of that was a damn good workout. I'm really
Right.
glad I lifted today. There are also times when you're like, I don't care that I lifted today. That actually doesn't make a difference in how I enjoy it or how I think about it. And when you have your finger on the pulse, right? Like imagine you literally have your hand on the heart. Is you can feel the change over time to where it goes from, super excited, making tons of progress. Okay. Not making progress, still pretty excited. Not making progress, not excited. Not making progress, I fucking just hate this. This is not fun at all. And we've seen that manifest in ourselves and we've seen that manifest in other people. And kind of circling back to that point about like you being the king of anecdote,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear you kind of riff on your time just training really hard and not really caring about mindset with respect to training.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, like, as you're saying it, I'm thinking to myself, like, man, how many times in my career of lifting were there moments where, like, you, moments where you go from, like, okay, it's you know, you're training really hard and it's like everything feels great and amazing to like very quickly it turns to like this just I don't even want to do this anymore. Like I'm gonna quit. And then back again. And this like
Right.
bouncing around between those points. But yeah, it's interesting to me because it's like I feel like there's a definite like uh, there's a definite like correlation between like the training load you're sort of putting yourself through and how quickly you start to become just basically exhausted
Right.
from it mentally. And that's obvious, right? I mean, the harder if you do nothing, it's hard to be like tired of it, right? um, but like there's a definite like it's not. I don't think it's linear. I think
Right.
there's an exponential curve there where as you continue to increase the training volume and the training load, like things just get worse and worse and worse, or harder and harder and harder. The psychological effect is just brutal. I will say this that's kind of interesting is like when I trained with Goff, we would train basically as hard as with the Bulgarians. Like those two times we were doing almost identical things. Um, and the difference between the two, so like I probably actually trained harder with Goff than I did with Abajev, like for rep for rep, and the amount
Right.
of insanity of like just there was no limits with Goff. It was just like, we're gonna take 25 attempts at a clean and jerk. Like, fine, that's awesome. You're tough. Um, Abajev would just be like, at some point it's just like, okay, you're not gonna make it. Like,
Hmm.
uh, but so I say this because the only difference between the two was the environment, really the environment. And the environment with Abajev was so much more regimented and so much more controlled than it was with Goff. Where with Goff, like training, we would train super hard, but the two things that were distinct about it was that it always felt like it was my choice.
Hmm.
It always felt like this is what I want to do this thing. Like, let's
Wow.
push. Like, and he would push, but I never felt like I couldn't say, nah, I'm not doing that. Like, I never felt like I was like, oh, he's gonna not coach me if I can't do this, or I say I'm too tired. I never did, but it always felt like that option existed, right? And the environment was such that he was extremely motivating, and like he was as passionate. He brought tons of energy to the equation. He wanted to see you succeed. He was trying to push. He was always looking for something to, how can we get something out of this? um and then Abajev was like the opposite. It was like a black hole. There's zero emotion. There was very little like sense of like this guy's building you up or really cares. You're only as good as the last lift you did. You can make a PR on Monday, and by Wednesday it's like, why are you so lazy? Um, and the environment was so controlled. It was so regimented, right? There was never a chance for any variety from the perspective of, well, let's squat again, or let's clean and jerk, or let's, like it's the same exercise, the same ingredients, just there was no mixing them up. There was
Hmm.
never like a let's push for this, or let's keep going, or none of that. And I felt way more destroyed with Abajev than I did with Steve. With Goff, it was always like I left the gym feeling motivated. I mean, there would be days where I wanted to fucking quit, that it was like, this sucks. But it was always like a choice. Like, I'm there because like, okay, I know what I want to try to do in this thing in the sport, so I'm going to just keep going. Um, and you'd leave the gym having not made any PRs, or being hurt, or hating it. And, definitely like demotivated and wanting to not do it. But it was a different feeling than like feeling like you have to do it, like you're trapped.
Hmm.
Which is really odd. Which is this is like almost a tangent, but one reason why I believe that this idea that there's a lot of like that there's this kind of like people are trapped in these environments, right? And that's how they're extracting the greatest performances they can from them. I don't know if that's the case, because I don't know if it's like, sunshine and rainbows, but like it's very hard to extract exceptional performance from somebody who's not also motivated to do it. Um, but yeah, that's sort of a tangent, but that was the major difference. And I think a lot of it is like, it's, it's this sort of level of like, okay, fatigue, this psychological fatigue is going to set in if you're pushing as hard as possible. But some things, because like if we assume that when psychological fatigue starts to accumulate, it increases your sensitivity to the environment, and it increases your sensitivity to, this idea of like disruption to things, um, that if you're in an environment where nothing changes and your sensitivity to it rises, you're gonna constantly feel
Mm,
more and more of that lack of change. There's no novelty to sort of give you any reprieve from it. It's
right.
like the walls kind of feel like they're closing in. And so even though the training volume and the load is the same in two different environments, you're able to potentially stave off the psychological fatigue effects, or the sensitivity,
Mm,
rises with it. But but even though the sensitivity is higher, there's like you're also sensitive to change. So any modification or adjustment or
right.
variation has a huge impact. It instantly feels like relief, right? An analogy for this would be like when you're driving a car at 10 miles an hour and you slow down 20%, you're going 8 miles an hour. You can't even tell the difference between those two speeds, right? But if you're driving 100 miles an hour and you slow down to 80, it feels like you're crawling. So it's like
Right.
the sensitivity is higher because the magnitude is so much higher. So that's kind of, I'm not exactly sure where I was going with all this, but like the idea that like those two environments were very different despite the training being almost identical, yet probably the same amount of fatigue was accumulating, if not more, in I mean, in with golf. But the environment was such that it didn't magnify that effect, right? It didn't magnify the fatigue, or maybe the fatigue was, I was able, you're able to sort of, um, counteract or
Right.
distract from some of that fatigue because there is so much of that. And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
No, I mean, I honestly, I don't know how many podcasts we've recorded together. I thought that was one of the fucking coolest things you've ever said.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, like it's one of those things where we go to hop on the podcast and it's like, Max, what are we going to talk about? I don't know, and I just like I look up and I'm like, okay, what have I been thinking about? Here's a topic. Hey Max, let's talk about this. And you're like, okay. And you go into it so cold and so blind, and then to hear you tie in something that's like so interesting and so unique, which is kind of what I tried to mention from the outset, in a way that's like, oh, we can explore all of that in 50 different directions.
Yeah.
And that's really cool to hear. Like, I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about that,
Yeah.
and like compare those two things in that same way. And I think a useful place to kind of direct this, kind of given the differences there, would be, it's almost like coach psychology augments athlete psychology. And if you know that, you kind of take accountability over your coaching practice. Like, how do I coach? Because I realize that I can, for the better or worse, change the
Yeah.
person's experience of the sport and like their performance in the sport. Because I can be like a dickhead, I can be terrible, I can be awful, and the way you express that through that explanation is like I can just be uncaring and unwavering.
Yeah.
It's like, and man, you put it really well. Where it was, you just hit a PR the other day. Today you miss a lift, and it's like you're a loser. Like, you suck. Like, that's
You
the
know,
most demoralizing way
he
to
actually,
coach.
I'll tell you what Abijayev actually said to me. He told me when I first started training, he was like really impressed because I trained really hard. He actually said, he told Alex Kraichev, he said, Max, he said he trains like Naeem. He reminds me of
Wow.
Naeem. He trains like Naeem because I didn't sit down. I just would lift and whatever.
Yeah.
And then he was like, he could be Olympic champion. And I was like, I don't know how I can describe how fucking pumped you can feel.
Yeah.
If the metric of how pumped you can feel, if a 100 is that, I was at 100. Fast forward like 3 weeks or a week, probably a week. It felt like 3. And I'm like, I was front squatting like 230 at the time. And I'm missing 70 kilo front squats. Like not like not like, oh, I don't want to do them and they're like slow. Like I dropped the bar.
Wow.
And then I'm like fucked up, like broken. And he tells Alex, he says to everybody, he like in front of everyone in the gym, he would do this thing where he put his like index finger on his nose and point it down, like, oh, he's like sad. And he's like, he is cry. He is Olympic champion of no training. Like it was like you go from the of 100, like fuck, the greatest coach in the world, like this infamous, insane figure in my mind thinks I could do this. Oh, not more than a week later, like he thinks I'm the fucking champion of no training because I missed because I like, got fucking wrecked on everything.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's super funny. And like, you just realize like how wild it is. Like, just like how much psychology plays into this. I mean, to give Abujayev credit, he said to one of us at some point, he said the only thing that the most important quality anyone can have is willpower. He's like, your brain decides everything. This is a guy, you have to imagine, this is a guy who literally has seen anyone on the internet, any new YouTube guy or any of these, the weightlifting gurus of the world, everything they say they've seen and know and all this, like this man did everything. He started giving people drugs, coached more champions than everyone else in the world, like was in the fucking heartbeat of like the fucking, he is in the center. He's seen everything. And he would say something like that, like it all comes from your brain. He never said anything like, oh, you got to have talent, or, like he never talked ever about like selecting athletes for how high they can jump or how fast they can run, or, all the like bullshit stories you hear from like the Chinese teams, like, oh, they select for people. They don't. The selection process is easy. Just find the kids that want to win. But that was his thing. Like he was like, it's all from your brain. It's all in your mind. Martin used to say this really funny thing. He's like, yeah, Abujayev, he just wants you to believe. He just wants you to believe, that's his system. And if you believe, then he'll give you some Dianabol. I'm just kidding. But he was just poking fun at him. But yeah, it was like the same kind of thing. Like everything was from the mind. And so, psychological fatigue, anytime you start to accumulate that, or the way you behave as a coach, or the way you program as a coach, you have to factor that in, because at some point, people are doing this kind of training. They're pushing through super monotonous things. And, if you have the demeanor of somebody who is, uncomfortable or uncaring, or sort of, whatever, feels like your vibe comes off to somebody the wrong way, like you can start to impact that and you're going to get a worse performance, right? I mean, how often do we see athletes switch from one coach to another and then, they excel, right? They find some other system or some other coach that really like resonates with them.
Well, and that's like, there's like this perceptual load that you can change or augment based on, the relationship you have with someone. It's like, I can reduce their fear or their like stress related to training just based on how we interact. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not this, I oftentimes when I talk about this stuff, it feels super contrived. It's like, oh, I have this like coaching handbook. I need to build a good relationship that has these different qualities. And it's like, no, again, I think that research is very descriptive. I'm not saying you're not gonna read the research and think about it and change practice, but I'm saying Sophia Jowett has this model, and it's called the 3+1 C's, and it's like it kind of describes the coach athlete relationship in a way where it's talking about like how you can measure its effectiveness or the quality of it. And
Right.
the C's that she talks about are closeness, complementarity, co-orientation, and there's another one I'm escaping. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but it's like, how do you rate on these aspects of the relationship? Do you have closeness? Do you have complementarity and co-orientation? Are you moving towards the same goals?
Yeah.
Like if those things are maximized, you're going to get a better return from training. So I imagine like Dr. Kyle Pierce and Kendrick Ferris just had one of the best relationships you could imagine, right? And of course, Dr. Kyle Pierce is one of the greatest dudes. He's like such a nice guy. He's so caring, so invested, so interested, so relaxed, laid back. He's exactly what some people really need. And then you mentioned Steve Goff.
Yeah.
He's what, hearing you talk about him and the Asha and people who were coached by him, it sounds like that's kind of what you guys either needed or like really benefited from. So I think
Yeah.
the way the coach approaches it, not from a rigid prescriptive, I'm going to learn as much as I can standpoint, but just like from a compatibility standpoint. I mean, like we've worked together in the past, and I think your perspective and approach to training, and another good example is like in the back room at competitions. It's like, how does the athlete carry themselves? Like, how does the athlete, how are they carried in the back room? How does the coach handle their own at like mindset in the back room or their own approach to competition? From personal experience, I remember when I was handling Sarah Wright, I handled her at the Arnold, and she's like, I'm super laid back. I'm not overly serious. I just need someone to help count, not to freak out. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
great. Like, I don't get overly excited. Like, I get excited and I'm super enthused and I want to make lifts and do really well. And I'm going to make sure I do the best job I can. But I'm not jumping Joe somebody, I'm not Mr. Scream his head off. I'm not going to get in your ear about how you were put on this earth to lift weights. I might go somewhere, but I'm not going there. And some people, they don't want that and they don't need it. Some people absolutely love it, and that changes performance. And I think
Yeah.
from a training standpoint, we see this happen too, where you got like this augmentation based on, hey, I know training's tough. You're tougher. Like, let's get after it. And you're like, oh, I believe I can do this. And I don't know how much that changes or what it makes up or what it allows you to endure. There's obviously something about Goff's training that allowed you to take that much of a quote unquote beating over time. And if we think about, this concept of like exertion load or stress index that Mike Teixeira will talk about, as you get like higher on the RPE scale, fatigue, like exertion and stress goes up. As you do more volume, the same thing happens. So the fact it was so low volume from like a intra set fatigue standpoint,
Yeah.
you're kind of just topping out on performance. I mean, there's obviously a lot of fatigue accumulated because you're just missing lifts and you're doing hard training, but you're not doing sets of 20 to failure, and you're not doing repeated sets. You're not doing heavy sets of 10 to failure.
Yeah.
And you're not doing like 10 sets of 10. So if you take that to the extreme, you could say, just do a shit ton of volume and the coach's style will augment that. And it's like, you can't say that. Because if you did 10 sessions a day and you did 10 sets of 10 every session, you're going to not feel great. So there's like this area we can operate where we can actually have an effect on performance and change it positively, somewhat unintentionally, but also in a directed way. And kind of tying this into something that's a little more practical and actionable, when we think about clarking, you are the king of just taking heavy singles nonstop with no care in the world. And like, I hear this and I'm like, holy shit, how do you take that many clean and jerks at 160? I would be dead. Like, I could not survive that psychologically or physiologically. I would just melt into the ground. I would assimilate into the platform and I'd be a piece of wood for the rest of my life. That would honestly be what I'd be condemned to. So from your perspective, your standpoint, I know I have lifters who do have a hard time with this. How do you approach clarking because of fear? because of a lack of an ability to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
And then once we talk about that, we can talk about, okay, let's limit psychological fatigue so we don't get to the point of clarking.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough that's a tough question, because it's like, first you got to decide, like, why is somebody clarking, right? Like, what is the reason? Is it just purely like fear? Is it that they're at a point where, like, I mean, I guess everybody clarks because of fear, right? You're afraid to go under the bar, or you don't feel like it's right, so you're just like, you can't convince yourself to just go for it.
Right.
But it's a question of, like, where is the fear coming from? Is it coming from being, emotionally fatigued, or psychologically fatigued enough that the sense that you can cultivate all of the faculties of your body to actually execute moving under the bar in a way that feels like you're going to make the lift, like, that's gone? Like, you just, you don't believe you can actually get under the bar? Or is it like, the kind of thing where there's a built up sort of, latent sort of low level fatigue that your, lack of motivation is just kind of making it difficult to care about it enough to go under it? I mean, like, it's a challenge, right? I think personally, within a training program, the approach to training has to be such that you have a methodology in place that allows you the flexibility to incorporate whatever elements of training that can reduce fatigue or increase arousal or increase participation and motivation, can be sort of swapped in and out, right? So that means that, like, your program can't be so hyper focused on, the exact same elements of training to the point that you exclude the ability to have any variation in your program, meaning like the Bulgarian style, right? If all you do is the same thing over and over again, and you interject a new movement or something, or a new method or a new style of training, it would throw everything off. You have to have the ability to say, okay, this person is clarking. This session is just not worth pursuing, right? We don't want to get hurt. What's the next right thing to do? Well, we have to, this person either needs to recover from this and recuperate, or this person needs some kind of new stimulation to get them, motivated and excited again, right? Some kind of novel stimulus initially, but then, a change in the methodology we're using. So, changing volume or intensity, or, a whole bunch of different factors, anything you can imagine. Because when someone starts clarking a little bit, it can turn into a very bad problem where they start doing it on a lot of stuff, right? And it becomes like a major issue where it's not just like being afraid to go under a bar. It's like every time you put 100 kilos on, you just freak out about it, and that's something you don't want to have happen. So you need to have in place the methods within your program, within your system, that allow you to quickly, pivot and start doing the right things, start doing things that are going to be positive, that are going to be, uplifting, motivating, driving progress, and at the same time, starting to reduce some of that psychological fatigue, right? I mean, the ultimate goal, like, I've thought about this a lot, and you look at the training from like the 1980s, right? Like, just the kind of training was fucking crazy, right? Like, they were doing so much training. Everyone was on tons of drugs, and there was just like, it was just a buffet of volume and craziness, and they had humongous results. I mean, those numbers from the 80s are mind blowing, right? Like, imagine having a guy go into the 61s class, right? A guy going up against, Lefi Ben. Lefi Ben snatches 141, and then clean jerks 175, and then a dude opens up 10 kilos above that in the snatch.
Wow.
Right? I mean, or he's Naeem snatch 152, right? clean and jerking 15 kilos more than that. Like, just the shit was crazy. But the thing that's interesting is, like, obviously when they took more drugs, they did more training, and they just kept doing more training, and that was the solution, right? It was like, okay, we're just going to keep adding more and more training and make it harder and harder and heavier and heavier. So our goal is probably similar, right? We're probably, as a country of athletes, that are not in that same system, we still have to try to get the most out of our people. And so, like, your system of training should be such that you are trying to train at the limit of your abilities and do as much as you possibly can, because that's going to produce the greatest results, right? There's no one, succeeding that's training, barely at all, unless
Right.
you're a young person or extraordinarily talented. But even then, increasing the amount of training you do is probably going to increase your results. You look at, like, an Olivia Reeves, and it's like she trains 3 or 4 days a week. Like, yeah, she's an extraordinary talent, right?
Mm,
Because most people training 3 or 4 days a week are not that strong. Like,
right.
most teenagers aren't that strong. There are no other teenagers that strong, anyways. But I'm getting to the point here, which is that if our goal is to do as much as possible, but when you push to that limit of doing the most training or the hardest training, when you push towards the edge, you're inevitably going to run into all of these other things that are a problem. Obviously, we know the physical limitations, getting injured and, not making progress because you're overtrained. But before that, we know that the psychological stuff starts to become a problem basically first. And so it's like, you're trying to do as much as you can. You're trying to make it, you're trying to, like, incorporate this training in a way that is tolerable, but not just tolerable. You're trying to make it motivating and exciting, so that the
Mm,
training is something that's actively, stimulating to a person's mind as they do it. If you just keep doing, like, if you just did 8 triples in the snatch every workout, you'd be so tired of that so quickly. But if those 8 triples were, that same 24 reps was broken up in a myriad of different ways, and maybe included some other exercises, and, like, had a lot of interesting aspects to it that created a bit of, a bit more stimulating environment, you'd probably be able to tolerate that a little bit better. And then layer on top of that a coaching environment and an environment that is exciting, that might make it even more tolerable, right? Like, if you think about the kind of training that CrossFitters did or do to get to the CrossFit Games and compete there, it's just insane, right? But there's so much variety that it's like, you can arguably, like, they can probably accumulate so much more training because there's so much more stimulation that
mm,
isn't just the same thing, right? Versus, like, running a marathon. If all you did was just run the marathon over and over and over again, you're probably going to get, broken and burned out super fast. Same with weightlifting, right? So that's my theory on it. That's sort of my, what my experience tells me, is that, incorporating a training system or integrating a training system that capitalizes on the ability to apply variability and variation and excitement and stimulation that's not just, not just pure monotony. Also, understanding that we can't just do random shit because that's not productive,
right.
but, finding that way to do that, and then cultivating an environment and a coaching strategy and a coaching demeanor that suits an athlete well, right? If an athlete believes in you and believes in the system and it's stimulating, then you have a magical combo there.
So I'd like to almost think about it like this, and I think this will give us a great um, segue into how to program this. It's like having the same ingredients. So you have 3 ingredients. You have rice, you have beef, and then you have some sort of vegetable. And it's making it in the least appetizing way possible. It's like
Right.
literally making it in the worst way possible. Imagine you boiled the beef, You fried the vegetables.
Wait, are we in the UK? You're boiling the meat?
We also don't use salt. Oh, we must be.
Seb's
Um,
cooking this.
so we boil the beef. We like fry the vegetable, but without like a batter or seasoning. And the rice is as hard as possibly imaginable and like edible. And then you
Yeah.
put that in a bowl and you say, "Eat this."
Yeah.
Okay, it's the same nutrients, right? It's all the same stuff. It's the same like training variables. Okay, then you take it away and you say, "I'm gonna fry the beef. I'm gonna, steam the veggies, and then I'm gonna season them, and then I'm gonna also cook the rice so it's like the perfect texture." And then you have that, and you're like, "Oh, these two things are completely dissimilar." Well, not really, and that's training. That's programming. You have 20 snatches between a certain range. You have 20 clean and jerks. You have 30 squats. You can structure them in certain ways to make them more interesting and digestible and tolerable, and you can structure them in ways that don't do that. So when we talk about, say, something like a cluster, so we minimize intraset fatigue and we maximize, or we err on maximizing, like power output and technical, like, I don't want to say efficiency, but like technique. And then we also maximize like the amount of force we're able to produce. So we're trying to maintain and preserve qualities we want to develop so that we can have higher values on every rep and every set, potentially every exercise and through every workout.
Yeah.
Right. So again, you're taking the ingredients, which are the same, you're manipulating them in a way that make them more interesting and tolerable and effective. When we think about training, Max, how do you structure, say, a training week and then say training months? I mean, we can get as granular as you want, but just thinking pragmatically, if we program to minimize psychological fatigue, maximize the likelihood of not clerking weights or going under the bar, what does that look like on paper, just broadly?
Yeah, I mean, largely it's going to be like you said, like it's kind of a funny analogy, but it's like you're like a Mexican restaurant, right? You've got like the same 5 ingredients and you
Yeah,
have to just mix them in different orders, but they
right,
they all are very unique dishes.
right,
So yeah, I mean, it's that the first approach is like what are the things that people become um accommodated to first, right? Like what is the thing that is initially very like very that you're very sensitive to.
right.
And what I would say is that's going to be like the combination of sets and reps and how you um how you execute the volume and load of training, right? If you do the exact same intensity and the exact same sets and reps, if you do the 5x5 every Monday, like you're going to very quickly accommodate to that
Right.
cycle, like from a stimulation standpoint. Initially, it's comfortable and it's very unique and very uniform. And so it works well. But if you continue to do that, it's going to become exhausting very quickly. The next thing would be the X. So having a variety of rep ranges and intensities throughout the week. There's some undulation, between different ranges of intensities and different set sizes, different size workouts throughout the week, right? So these things are pretty commonly known already. This is pretty obvious stuff, but that variety, just that
Mm,
variety in and of itself provides a much better groundwork for staying, interesting and motivating. And then on top of that would be like the exercise selection, right? This is obviously governed by what's needed. You have to choose exercises that are going to help you. But manipulating the actual exercise you use and applying like a pool of exercises rather than
mm,
2 or 3.
right,
And that pool is something that could be, rotated through on a regular basis, or it could be something that's incorporated throughout an entire block. It could be something that's sequenced a certain way. But in general, you need a variety of exercises that are very, very similar, that address your needs, but at the same time offer enough novel experience that just the act of coming in to do an exercise that might be slightly different creates a new sort of excitement and adherence and motivation, for the program.
I think you saying that the thing, and I'm thinking about my own training. One of the most exciting things is like well planned change. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, like one of the most powerful things is just saying instead of this thing we always do, we're gonna do something a little different.
Right.
And like the magnitude and direction of that change, there are an infinite, no, there are like a near infinite number of things we can change. Okay, but
Yeah.
saying okay, instead of this 5x5 we do on Monday, we're going to do a 6x4. Then we're
Right.
going to do an 8x3 and then a 12x2. That's a training block.
Yeah.
What it does, and again, I've been consuming a lot of the data driven strength stuff. I'm just like deep down that rabbit hole. And one of the quotes that I picked from an episode, it's episode 14, and this is from Zach Robinson. He says, as long as this set has a job, is this kind of decision fulfilling that goal? And as long as we're doing so, repetition range will take care of itself.
Right.
So it's this idea that does this set have a job? What's the job of the set? Is it to build muscle, to improve endurance? Um, is it to improve like strength characteristics, improve the skill of expressing strength, right? So if you say, hey, this is a strength set, or it's a hypertrophy set, or it's an endurance set. If you can do that, you can quickly figure out how to program it
Right.
and pick the rep
Exactly.
range because it's straightforward. I mean, it's not the thing that's complicated about training is the starting point, the process, and the ending point. But like each discrete decision can be very simple and straightforward.
Yeah.
Each discrete decision of like, do I do a single here? It's like, are you practicing the test? If you're
Yeah.
practicing the
Yeah.
test, you do a single. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, we need to get bigger. It's like, well, you're not gonna do a single. I mean, there's no difficulty in deciding that, and you're not going to do a set of 30 because realistically, like hitting the right effort level and then also being willing to do that is fucking nil. No one's
Yeah.
doing sets of 30. I don't care who you are, how
Yeah. Yeah.
hard you train, how loud you yell brother in the weight room, how much oil you put on your body before you lift. You're not going to do a set of 30. And you're not getting to an 8 or 9 RPE. Like that's fact.
Yeah.
So what I would say is like you'd have these kind of like broader concepts in mind, and then you would change those. That change is super fun. It's super stimulating, and I almost wonder thinking about this like I flip flop back and forth, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about there being like something specific to developing a range or like something specific to developing a rep number. So if we do, let's say we do fours, you almost like think about directed adaptations where it's like I want to build the endurance qualities and the strength qualities and everything that's associated with doing sets of four. So when we go to peak this thing we're doing, we improve this the most we possibly could. Now thinking about it sounds fucking stupid.
Yeah.
Like, because that's not the point. The point would be to do sets of four to get you to a better set of one. So why would you like put all your resources into sets of four? You should put it into doing a single the best you possibly can. What that's probably going to look like is more of like a pyramidal approach where you
Yeah.
have some like lighter sets and then you have some heavier sets and you have work in between, and it kind of fluctuates based on where you're at and what your needs are. So I'm almost wondering like, would it be wrong, not necessarily like would it be wrong, but do you think it would be efficient to do some sort of like linear periodization or linear programming where it is 5x5, 6x4, 8x3, 12x2, maintaining load, or changing that slightly to go top set, down sets, same volume, same volume, same volume, knowing that that change over time is going to accommodate fatigue that could be generated based on closeness to maximal exertion and the change in intensity? Or would you say it doesn't need to that be that like recipe focused? It could be a little bit different, and you would prescribe it somewhat differently. I'd just like to hear you riff on that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that like again, and this is something I've learned over a pretty like having spent all this time with like like engineers and developers now with the app, but like, it's like, what is the structure by which you think about how you do things? And like you just said, it's like you're saying like, okay, like a set of 4 does this, and this to whatever degree, right? Versus thinking about things from the perspective of like, okay, training is a process whereby we need to look at it as inputs and outputs, right? We take an athlete, we have inputs, which are, the amount of load and training volume we're going to do in a certain day, right? So this top down approach of like, okay, for this day, we've planned this much training load. And if you break that down, you could break that down as sets or as, number of reps or whatever. It's a load. And that's going to be based on what they can tolerate, where it falls in the week, like several other structural programming things. But then the question would become, okay, how do we execute this load to serve our end goal? And that's the end goal is what you have to say, our output. Our output is, it could be anything. Let's say it's a peaking phase or a pre-competition phase where it's like, hey, the output we're looking for is very high technical quality at very high maximum peak intensity. Okay, well, we have this plan to execute 18 reps in this workout, right? And our base intensity for the session is 80% and our peak intensity is 90%. What's the best way to do this? Well, you have to look at like a bunch of factors, which would be like, okay, how do we maximize for peak technical output and the highest quality? Well, we know that doing some volume before we get to the heaviest weight is going to help us dial it in. And we know that, kind of pyramiding up is a better approach than just doing a bunch of volume, then doing the singles at 90% or whatever it is, 95%. So it's like you kind of would look at like, okay, well, what structure, how do we organize this stuff to actually get to our desired output? And then, you do that same process. You look at the same process from every perspective, which is to say, what is the intended outcome? Just like you said, like, what is the purpose of this set? And I would go so far as to say, even like a little bit more broad, what is the purpose of this session, of this particular workout, for snatch or for clean or for squat? Like, what is it directed at? What are we trying to achieve by doing it? And then that should influence how you do it, which seems super obvious when you say it. But it's funny that a lot of people think only in the sense that, like, strength equals 5, hypertrophy equals 10. Right. And so you end up in this place where it's like, well, like there's a lot of different ways to approach this. You could also look at this and see, like, when I trained with Shaco, he had me do these interesting sets where, like, you would do like he would do a lot of like pyramids, right? Like, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, then 4, 6, 8, 10 or something, going up and down. And then he also had these things where we would do like, a set of 8, then a set of 2, then a set of 6, then a set of 3, then a set of 7, then a set of 1, like odd, like sort of like sawtooth pattern thing. I think he called it the ragged method. But it's funny because, he'd ask like, which one is easier to do, the same number of reps as a pyramid or as this other ragged thing? And it always was the ragged thing. It was way easier to do it, right? Even if it was the same sets and reps, just broken up in this kind of weird way. And so it's like, if you're optimizing for, like those two workouts, a pyramid versus the ragged method, if your outcome or your desired outcome is execution of the training volume, like trying to accumulate as much training or trying to execute as much volume as you can with as low of an exertion as you can, then the ragged method obviously is better because you can, it's much easier to tolerate, right? Is the end effect different? It's like, it's hard to say. I don't know if you could measure that. It might not be, right? But ultimately, it's like there's an example of having a directed purpose towards the session and then actually implementing a structure for training and an actual process that, is at least logically guided towards that outcome, right?
Well, I think the reason that's important is because how you train directly, and this is the point of the podcast, right? Like how you train directly influences your perception of training,
Yeah.
and your enjoyment of it, and your motivation to do it, your ability to do it, and then like your willingness to do it.
Yeah.
And that can be handled better or worse based on the dogmatism you carry to it. And man, listening to you talk about this again, it's got me like thinking about my coaching process of why do I feel tied to reps or a certain number of reps or a certain like number of reps over time. Again, this idea that like fours, even if so, I'm not you concede that fours aren't special, but why do you feel like it's necessary to continually do fours? And
Right.
maybe there's this thing where you can do a certain intensity or percent 1 RM and above if you have 4 reps or less, or if you have 4 reps or more. So if you do 4 reps and less, you can do 82.5 to 100% if you manage reps. If you have more than 4 reps, you can do less than 82% for a top set or something, or
Yeah.
straight sets. So if you think of it as the gateway to intensity or percent 1 RM, and then you think of it as a gateway to volume or load across time, you can then say like, I can't be married to any of these. It's
Yeah.
not about the SAID principle where it's like specific adaptations to imposed repetition range. This is just not something necessary to consider. So you've got me needing to go back into the quote unquote lab, whatever that is, and like work on my programming prowess and figure this shit out, as most conversations
Yeah.
do. I
It's
think that's like a great place to wrap up. I don't know if you have any
Yeah.
final thoughts.
No, I was just gonna say it's really funny because this is literally exactly what we were talking about. We're in the office today working. Exactly what we're talking about as far as like how do we actually, like, how do we create a more intelligent methodology for for getting a machine to actually like build something. So like what's the rule based approach to this? Because if we have rules, we can then create logic around that and build off of that, right? And then eventually, a machine learning model will take over, but like you have to start somewhere, which is to say like what is the, what are the logic behind this? And it is funny because like so many times you run into this thing where you're like, I guess my thinking makes sense, but is it true? And it's like you're saying, like, do the reps matter? That's a 4, right? Like, does that matter? Like, am I
Hmm.
just stuck to something because it seems like it makes sense when the reality is like maybe it's very much not that important, right?
So in the way my thinking started to shift, and maybe we'll talk about this off air, is that the number of reps, and it comes back to that quote from Zach, like the number of reps allows the set to do a job.
Yes.
And by your ability to do a job is predicated on the percent of 1 RM, because the adaptation is determined by the percent of 1 RM
Yeah.
largely.
Yeah.
And then like total volume and stuff. But like if we just think about it, like if you do a single, what that allows you to do is a certain percent of 1 RM that has certain effects. If you do 2 reps, 3 reps, all the way down, that allows you to access a certain percent of your 1 RM, which has certain effects.
Yep.
Now, how you build that out across time has like different effects and different like effects over time at different time, like different aspects of like the time period. So within the day, within the week, within the month, within like the year and years of training. So that's like a place in training theory that I don't know, maybe we call it training theory, but that's like a place in training that I'm trying to access with my mind currently.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Same.
I'd
Similar
love
thing.
to continue the conversation at some point.
Yeah.
if people are interested in learning more about the weightlifting.ai and exactly what it does and how it does it, where can we direct them if they want to sign up and try their hand at it?
Yeah, go to weightlifting.ai. It's we've got a 2-week trial. There's a holiday sale still running, 10%
Oh,
off.
awesome.
So you can end up getting it for $30, less than $30 a month, if you sign up for the year at a time. And then on top of that, if you're interested in anything, go ahead and shoot me a DM on Instagram, max_Aita, or, check out anything remote coaching with myself or you, obviously, on teamaita.com. Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys enjoyed the episode, you have any thoughts about training, you want to either discuss it, know more about it, or do it, and you want us to guide the ship, yeah, head to teamata.com. Reach out to either of us on Instagram. We're pretty easy to find. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the podcast. Please leave a rating, only if it's 5 stars. Otherwise, go kick rocks. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.